finally read the Iliad a few weeks ago. I have talked about reading it for years because I love The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which is about the Iliad, and I want points to say I'm pretentious and a lit nerd and really like history and all that. So, reading it, it was about time, right? And so I read it, and it turns out it's not just about Achilles and Patroclus. It turns out there's other characters in it. I mean, the story starts, anger, sing goddess the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus. So he's like the character that's in the line, right? But he and Patroclus aren't they aren't active characters for a good 90% of the story. It's mostly just battle scenes. Like, a lot of battle scenes. And the bits that aren't just battle scenes are very interesting. There's just a lot of fighter McFight-Pace, son of, what's his name, son of the king of this country, son of probably a god, kills this person, Trojan guy, son of just on and on and on. But the parts that aren't that are actually very interesting because this isn't just a book about the Greeks like Song of Achilles is, it's a book by the Greeks. And so their worldview is very present in the entire thing because it's about them, they are writing it. Homer is a Greek from ancient times. Like he is writing from his perspective. And his perspective is very different than my 21st century, very American, Christian, raised in a capitalist society perspective. And part of that is they thought that the gods controlled everything. Like, not just the gods were in control, but the gods controlled them, down to the emotions that they were feeling. There's a scene towards the end of this, when we actually start to get Achilles and Patroclus in the actual story, where Patroclus has just killed Sarpedon. And Sarpedon's friend, Glaucus, I don't know, he's upset about the death of his friend. He wants to do something about it. But he's been fighting for a while. Turns out that takes a lot of energy, stabbing people, running around, all that, bit of effort. He's also been injured in the battle, so he prays to Apollo. And it says, "So he spoke in prayer, and Phoebus Apollo heard him, and at once relieved the pain, dried up the dark blood from the ugly wound, and filled him with fresh energy." Homer doesn't say that Glaucus was reinvigorated because he was upset at the death of his friend, or that adrenaline coursed through his veins. He says that Apollo re-energized him. The source of the action was Apollo. It wasn't Glaucus himself. He wasn't doing this to himself. It was something Apollo did to him. It's easy for us to read this and just think of the Greeks as these silly we fall into this belief that in history people were just stupid. We're just so much smarter than all those people of the past. Oh, those silly Greeks. They thought they had no self-control. They thought the gods were controlling everything that they did and that the emotions that they felt were a product of the gods. So glad we aren't like that. We're so much smarter. Except, how often do we point to external factors to explain our own actions? I think we see this a lot when we talk about justice or systemic issues. Take a really simple example, like a kid acting out in class. We might say that they're attention-seeking, but more likely we'll point to things like a difficult home life, or that they're trying to cover academic struggles, or that they just have underdeveloped social skills, or any other number of factors. And this isn't to say that those factors aren't valid. They certainly are. They can definitely be playing an influence. But those are still external things that are impacting how somebody behaves. And it's all well and good to say that we don't control who we are necessarily, that there's all this personality and characteristics. Those things aren't always things we control. But surely we control our actions. We control what we do, don't we? Now, take a moment to memorize these word associations. Now, name a laundry detergent, any laundry detergent. Have you got it? Did you say Tide? If you did, you just demonstrated an effect found in a 1977 study. And before I explain that a little bit, I'm just curious, why did you say Tide? Does it have anything to do with the fact that one of the word associations I just gave you was moon and ocean? Moon, ocean, tide? Yeah? Richard E. Nisbet and Timothy DeCamp Wilson ran this study, more formally, of course, back in 1977. And they would give participants word associations, and some participants didn't get right. You've got your control and your non-control. So the ones who weren't given these word associations, about 10% of them answered Tide when asked to name a detergent. that number increased to 20% in the group that was given these word associations. Yet when they were asked why they came up with tide as an answer, most of them said something along the lines of, oh, my dad uses it, or it's the most common brand, which are all logical conclusions. But it doesn't realize the fact that the likelihood of answering tide increased. That correlation can't really be denied, and similar studies have found similar occurrences. Just within this Nisbet de Camp-Wilson study, there are dozens of other mentions to studies which found little associations or minute details that were impacting people's decisions, even if they didn't realize it. So maybe we're not in control as much as we'd like to think. Maybe there are a lot of external factors that are influencing how we answer questions or the decisions we make. Ultimately, that is the question of free will. Boethius was a Roman philosopher in the 5th century, and he wrote this book, The Consolations on Philosophy. And in it, Boethius is having a discussion with this woman, philosophy. They're going back and forth discussing different topics. They cover a whole range of things. But the part that I want to talk about is in Book 5, when he talks about free will. Boethius asks philosophy if there's such a thing as chance, if chance exists. And she says that no, chance does not exist in the sense that random things can happen with no, what she calls, causal nexus. But chance does exist in the sense that there are things that happen which humans do not expect. And this is an important differentiation, because the first idea of chance implies that God is not in control of things, that God has not established what is going to happen. Whereas the second acknowledges that God knows what's going to happen, has ordered the universe to create this causal nexus. It is merely us humans who don't understand what's happening or don't have a way to predict what is happening. In short, God has predetermined everything. This established, Boethius is able to ask his real question. If everything is predetermined, how can we have free will? And philosophy, over the next several chapters, lays out her answer by establishing a series of facts. Free will must exist for justice to be true, because judgment can only be fair if the actions being judged were taken out of free choice. Secondly, for divine foreknowledge, in essence predetermination, to be true, the events it predicts must come to pass, because incorrect knowledge is not true knowledge, or fact, it is merely opinion. 3. There are different forms of knowledge, and we cannot truly know anything beyond our form of knowledge, because we are simply not capable of thinking in that way. If this is starting to get confusing, I'm with you, but think of it this way. If I exist in a world which is entirely two-dimensional, I simply could not comprehend three-dimensional shapes. Depth would merely not exist. To everyone else existing in a 3D world, my inability to comprehend depth would be absurd, but it's simply beyond my form of knowledge. 4. God's knowledge is superior to our own, because our knowledge is limited. Not incorrect, merely limited. My 2D world is not false, it is just limited, just as your 3D world is not false, but it is limited. And because God's knowledge is of a higher form, say 4D, four-dimensional, we must yield to God's superior knowledge. 5. God exists outside of time, because God is eternal. This does not mean not dying or not ceasing to exist. That would imply the existence of a beginning and an end. Eternal means not being controlled to linear time. First, philosophy has proven that free will exists. And then she goes on to prove that predetermination must exist, that predetermination must be true. So with these two central elements of the question of free will versus predetermination established as true, she goes on to explain how they can coexist. She's saying God's foreknowledge exists outside of time, making it a superior form of knowledge. Because of that, God's foreknowledge, the existence of God's predetermination, is not a counterforce on our free will, because it being a counterforce is reliant upon a linear sense of time, which God does not have, which God exists outside of. The simplest way philosophy explains this is by comparing it to a man walking by. I'm at the park right now, I see all these people walking by enjoying the lovely weather and the sun in the sky, and seeing the sun, that is necessary. The sun must rise and set, and I know it always has and will always continue to. The people walking by, they don't need to be walking. That is a free choice that they have made, and my seeing them do so has no impact on that choice. If they are walking, and I can see that they are walking, it is a fact that I know, but my knowing it has no influence on their action. Boethius' argument isn't perfect, and obviously it relies on a belief in God, but it gives us a good starting place, and I like that he focuses on time. So let's look at that a little bit more. Today's outfit change is brought to you by the sun setting. When I was in 4th or 5th grade, my friend was obsessed with this Rebecca Stead book, When You Reach Me. And after months of haggling, I finally got around to reading it. And it was about this girl who's receiving these mysterious messages, and they know things about her that they shouldn't be able to know, and they're predicting the future. And if I'm being honest, I had to Google the Goodreads for this book because I could not remember the plot. I know there was something about a game show and a guy on a corner and a bus, and I really don't remember the plot at all. But the important bit was that it focused on this theory of time that I'd never heard before. And granted, I was 10 years old, so I didn't spend all that much effort contemplating the nature of time. But regardless, this theory of time that it introduced has shaped how I've thought about time and basically everything else ever since. Because it made sense. I'd never heard it before. Usually time is framed as something which passes by us. We are the constant, we are rocks in a river, and time is the thing rushing by. But what if instead we were the thing that moves, and time was the thing that was constant? The book uses a metaphor of a diamond ring, which I do not have. But I have this ring, a little crusty, missing some stones. I got it from my friend's mom, I believe, many years ago. But we are going to use that. Imagine that each stone on this ring is a moment in time, and as time goes by, it is not a passive action that happens to us. Instead, we are the ones moving, hopping from stone to stone across the ring. All the stones are already set. Everything that has happened and will happen is occurring at once in their own moments of time. We can't change anything because all the stones are set. I had to go and Google what this theory of time was called, or if it even existed. For all I know, Rebecca Stead is just a genius in her spare time and comes up with all these theories. It turns out it does exist. It's from a 1908 article titled The Unreality of Time by this guy John M.E. McTaggart. The M also stands for McTaggart, which, interesting choice. But his whole theory is based off of this idea that there's an A series and a B series in time, and they converge in different ways, and it's all very complex and beyond my ability to explain to you, but the metaphor, the ring metaphor, does a good enough job for our purposes. If you are interested in it, I do encourage looking into it, because while I might not be able to explain it, it is very interesting. All my sources are linked below, so you can go look at it there. This entire video may just be a compilation of me battling the sun, but we persevere. How we conceptualize time is central to how we think about free will. Ever since reading When You Reach Me, I haven't really enjoyed books about time travel because they rely on a belief that if we go back in time or we move through time, we can alter the events. But if we're thinking in line with When You Reach Me, aligned with McTaggart's theory, the static theory of time, then that's just not possible. But we theists believe that God predetermined the universe, that time was set by God. But maybe regardless of our belief in God, maybe time is set by its nature. The stones are set, they are immovable, we are just jumping through them. So now we return to our silly little Greeks who seem to believe they didn't control anything they did. Except when we break it down, it seems that we don't believe we control much either. But that idea of control, that's so appealing. We want to be in control. We want to determine our futures, determine what we're doing. And it turns out the Greeks had a similar belief. They wanted to be in control as well. We all love a good bit of autonomy. In Bruno Snell's The Discovery of the Mind, he spends a chapter focusing on Homeric conceptions of the self. That is, who you are, what makes you you, your MBTI type and all that. The things that are inherently you. Remember our friends Sarpedon and Glaucus? That analysis of Glaucus's emotions and feelings coming from Apollo is from Snell. He says, any augmentation of bodily or spiritual powers is effected from without, above all by the deity. Soon after he adds, we believe that a man advances from an earlier situation by an act of his own will, through his own power. If Homer, on the other hand, wants to explain the source of an increase in strength, he has no course but to say that the responsibility lies with a god. Yet still, why would we want to be the puppets of the gods? that's still not having autonomy. Snell points to the fact that the Greeks didn't have any other potential source of their actions. They didn't have a sense of self. So before the gods, they hadn't awakened to the idea that man can himself be the source of his powers. That means before the gods, everything you did, every emotion you felt, every action you took, came from a mysterious external factor. As Snell says, the heroes of the Iliad, however, no longer feel that they are the playthings of irrational forces. They acknowledge their Olympian gods, who constitute a well-ordered and meaningful world. This whole sun situation is same in focus. I'm in shadow, but it is superior to the alternative. I see the Greeks' lack of control as distressing. Their lack of free will is not what we want, but as opposed to being controlled by mysterious, magical, unknown forces, the gods are a welcome alternative. It would seem we move towards an understanding of the world which grants us a greater sense of free will, even if we don't really have it. Even in the modern world, we are still trying to believe in a sense of free will, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The researchers in that detergent study say, a final factor that may serve to sustain our belief in direct introspective awareness is motivational. It is naturally preferable from the standpoint of prediction and subjective feelings of control to believe that we have such access. It is frightening to believe that one has no more certain knowledge of the working of one's own mind than would an outsider with intimate knowledge of one's history and of the stimuli present at the time the cognitive process occurred. In short, not being in control is scary. The idea that memorizing moon ocean could determine how we answer a question is scary. It means that everything we think, have a passing thought about, perceive, interact with, all of that is going towards shaping how we behave without us having any knowledge of it. It means that autonomy is largely an illusion. So if biology and time and psychology and all of that seem to be arguing against free will, why is it not a foregone conclusion that it doesn't exist? Well, for one, there's our desire for autonomy, which is quite strong, but also there's the matter of justice. Remember Boethius' argument that without free will, justice could not exist, because it would be unfair to judge someone for an action that they did not take freely. If my roommate makes cookies and I want one of those cookies, I walk into the kitchen, I smell the cookies, I want one of those cookies, and I take one, I steal one of her cookies, and she's free to judge me for that, because I've just stolen from her. I'll probably still take the cookie, but she's free to judge me all she'd like. But if instead I walk into that kitchen and I take the cookie, not of my own free will, not because I looked at that cookie and I want one of those, but because some external force has controlled me, has forced me to take that cookie, then it's not fair of her to judge me, because I didn't take that action of my own free will. Her judging me for stealing the cookie would be the same as her judging me for somebody else stealing the cookie. So for justice to exist, free will must exist. One final location to conclude all of this. So what do we do? It would seem that we need free will to exist for responsibility and justice to mean anything, but it would also seem that there's all these things that are impeding even the possibility of free will. I mean, the issue arises in the Iliad, and this book is pretty old, and they haven't solved it yet, so what do we do? In the end, maybe it's a matter of belief. Not whether free will exists, but whether we believe it does, at least a little bit. I think we must concede that we are not quite as in control as we would like to be, but we do still make decisions. When I go to a bookstore and I'm deciding what I'm going to buy, whether I get a fast-paced fantasy or an introspective lit fic, or if I decide to save my money and go to the library, those are all decisions I'm making. And there's definitely things that are happening that I don't know, that things that are influencing me that I'm not aware of, that are leading me to make that decision. And maybe my decision was set long ago, be that by God or simply because time is set, time is predetermined. I'm merely passing through another stone on the ring. But the important part is that I believe that I made that decision, because if I go broke and have no money to spend on groceries because all my money went towards books, the responsibility is still on me. I still need to believe that I am responsible for my actions. So does free will exist? Yeah. But maybe we just need to believe it does, at least a little bit.